Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm a certified teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. Welcome back if you've seen my other videos. This video is a continuation of the video about my deaf ed major at Baylor University. I'm going to dig a little deeper into the internship portion of that. So if you haven't seen that first video, go ahead and watch that, and then this maybe will make a little bit more sense. So my deaf education major at Baylor University was 4 years, my senior year being a year-long internship. It was a two-part internship where the first semester was in Waco at a regional day school program for the deaf, and the second semester was at TSD, Texas School for the Deaf in Austin, Texas. So the way both parts of the internship were structured was a time of observation and gradually taking on more responsibility before doing 6 weeks of full teach and then kind of returning responsibility to your mentor teacher. I really like that structure because it builds you up to taking on full responsibility, and you can get acclimated to the environment, to the curriculum, whatever you need to do to prepare, and then you have that full 6 weeks of where you're in it, you're doing it, and it's super fun, and then you gradually kind of hand that back and have some time at the end to explore more of the school campus, other grade levels, classes, etc. So as I talk about each part, I'm going to talk about the top lessons that I learned. The first part is about 5 lessons, and the second part is about 4 lessons. There is some overlap, but I think this is a good way for you to get a good idea of what those two internships look like. So for the first part, I briefly mentioned that it was an RDSPD, a regional day school program for the deaf in Waco. I was placed in a pre-K through kindergarten classroom, and I had about 7 students. So the top 5 lessons that I learned for this part of the internship include language deprivation and language development, Deaf Plus, behavior management, curriculum, lesson planning, and documentation such as IEPs, ARDs, and that side of things. So for language deprivation and language development, my students came from diverse signing backgrounds, meaning that some families signed, some families didn't. Some had cochlear implants that they used them all day. Some did not want to wear their cochlear implants. So you had a lot of diversity, but the general trend in my classroom, and I've begun to see in other parts as well of deaf education, is that a lot of these students are arriving to school without an L1, without a first language. So this is an additional task for teachers and the students as well to begin to develop a fully accessible language. The effects of language deprivation are clear. It really does impact social skills, learning abilities, it impacts everything. But the other side of that is when students come into a language-rich environment that's fully accessible with their teachers and their peers, they begin to develop in amazing ways. And it's really cool and exciting to see that. So the challenge is that you're not only teaching language, but you're also teaching the curriculum, and you have to stay on track with that, which means that there's a lot of pre-teaching, concept building, vocabulary development, all of that that has to be done right alongside with the actual curriculum teaching. So the second thing that I learned was in regards to Deaf Plus. Some of my students had additional disabilities alongside their hearing loss, which included a learning disability, a visual impairment, and it includes a lot of different things, which as you can imagine is an additional challenge on top of not only having to teach language, the curriculum, and then also working to accommodate to make sure that they have full access to everything in the classroom. This is a really big challenge for me, but I got a lot of practice and training in scaffolding and differentiation, reading the students' IEPs to know what their accommodations were, to understand these are the things that they need for full access. I had to learn how to meet the students right where they were at, to understand how they were approaching the activities and be able to modify and adapt to whatever they needed. And it was really cool to see that when you make the proper adjustments, these students are successful and they do grow and acquire language and make progress in the curriculum. The third lesson has to do with behavior management. As I mentioned, the students had very limited language skills, which will lead to behavior problems. If they can't express what they're feeling, what they're thinking, they will grow increasingly frustrated. And when you're trying to correct these behaviors and maybe provide context for a misunderstanding, they don't quite have the language necessary to be able to understand. Another part of this is listening fatigue or attention fatigue. These students rely on visual cues and visual language for communication and instruction. We're constantly fighting to grab these students' attention by tapping, by waving, and for them to keep engaged visually can be very taxing on them cognitively. So by the end of the day, they may be very tired of people getting their attention by tapping, through waving, and this can lead to behavior problems. On the campus that I was working, they began to roll out a conscious discipline program. So this was really good exposure for me to understand different approaches to behavior management. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work in our classroom because it's very language based. It requires teachers to have very direct conversations with their kids. But when your students have come to school without a first language, it's really challenging. The fourth lesson is surrounding curriculum, lesson planning, IPs, and goals. For pre-K and kindergarten, you have a lot of units and themes. So there's animals, zoo, community helpers, etc. So that gives you a lot of room for creativity, and it's really fun. However, overall, the understanding of a scope and sequence and what you're really trying to work for feels very broad. And for me, it was a little bit overwhelming. I didn't quite know how to pace my lessons, and I got a little bit more practice in the second part of the internship, but I feel like this is a part of teaching that I still have to continue to learn and research about. On top of the curriculum and lesson planning that I have to do, I have to also keep in mind specific goals for each student that were developed in their ARD meetings. That can be related to self-advocacy with their hearing aids, language development, vocabulary development, and stuff like that. So there were a few other things that I had to keep in mind while teaching the curriculum as well. So the last lesson for this section is documentation, ARDs, IEPs, and the systems you have to use to document those things. This side of teaching was really confusing at first, and I knew that it was a legally binding document and that I had to follow these accommodations, modifications, goals. And my learning continued through this first part and the second part, and I didn't quite fully understand it until I started working. I'm going to talk a lot more about the IEPs and ARDs as it relates to my work experience, because that's really where I understood it and began to master it. So if you're interested in watching that video, make sure you subscribe. So to wrap up the first section of the internship, I would say that the word flexibility captures deaf education in general and really my experience at the RDSPD. There are so many complex layers in deaf education that one has to be flexible and ready to adapt and change to whatever new thing is thrown at you. So moving on to the second part of my internship, which was at TSD, this experience was incredible, and I'm so grateful that this was part of my program. While I was still in Waco for the first part of my internship, I completed an interview in ASL at TSD for them to assess my science skills and to know where to place me in the school. I was placed in middle school social studies, so that was 6th grade, 7th, and 8th grade. In 6th grade, we covered world cultures, 7th was Texas history, and 8th grade was US history. There were 4 lessons that I learned at TSD. These were language and culture, curriculum, behavior, and differentiation across different reading abilities. For language and culture, this time it was a lot more about my own language development. I'd been studying ASL for about 7 years when I got to TSD. I had taken high school ASL, college ASL, and worked in a deaf education classroom. And by that point, I began to feel confident in my signing skills. So when I got to TSD and I had a very hard time understanding what everybody was saying, there was definitely language and culture shock. My mentor teacher was deaf, and the majority of the middle school staff was deaf as well. What made it even more challenging was a lot of my students were deaf of deaf, so their parents were deaf and maybe had several generations of deaf people in their family, as well as having completed most of their schooling at TSD. They were incredible signers, and I learned so much from them. Not only were they very quick signers, but they had that kind of middle school slang and casual signing style, which made it even more challenging. So hopefully this isn't discouraging if you're learning ASL, but I think it's just indicative of how rich and vibrant ASL is as a language. Through being immersed in an ASL and deaf culture rich environment, I left TSD feeling so much more confident in my signing skills and ready to teach students of all grade levels. The second lesson is about curriculum. I got the opportunity to be challenged even more by having to teach 3 grade levels. It was really overwhelming to try to keep track of the scope and sequence and pacing for these 3 different classes. And I really did not master it even by the end of my internship, which I mentioned before was something that I wanted to keep on learning and improving on. And the third lesson is about behavior, and this was the hardest part of my time at TSD. I knew middle school was going to be challenging from a behavior standpoint going into it. I realized quickly that I had to figure out a good behavior management strategy. So I consulted with my mentor teacher and researched online, and what I ended up settling on was a system of jars and glass stones as a clear visual system of positive reinforcement and a nonverbal indicator that they were getting off track. So as they paid attention and completed their work, I would add stones and they would see it growing. But if somebody was getting off task and causing distraction to the whole class, I would remove some stones and they would quickly fix whatever behavior was causing that. Once they got to the top, the reward was to watch a movie, which we were able to watch at the end of the year. There's so much more to learn about behavior management, and I don't quite know if that's the best strategy, but part of it is you just have to learn and understand your students, understand the environment, and just learn as you go. During my time at TSD and while I was full teaching, I had such a hard time keeping the students' attention, which I think all teachers may relate to. But as I researched, I came across developmental perspectives on middle school and what that time means for these students. These students are developing socially. That is the primary goal for them. I realized that my lessons were structured in a lecture style that was developmentally not appropriate for these students. By doing this, I was fighting against what these students wanted to do, which was interact, talk, discuss with their peers. I didn't quite get the opportunity at TSD to implement this, but I realized that the best way to structure a classroom would be one that is oriented towards debate, discussion, group work. Obviously, you do have to set a lot of rules and structures in place so they don't get off track, but I really believe that this style of teaching in middle school really will benefit these students holistically. The fourth lesson that I learned is differentiation across different reading abilities. In each grade level, my students ranged in their reading and language abilities. So I had to learn how to adapt each lesson, even if it was for the same grade level, to best match the students. I think a reoccurring theme between the first part of the internship and the second part of the internship is that I had to learn how to meet the students right where they were at in order to help them make progress and grow. So that's it for all the lessons that I learned in the second part of the internship. Please let me know if you have any questions about either part, and if there are other topics or video ideas that you may have. Go ahead and subscribe so you can see any future videos that I post. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.